and not a single person in a position of authority has been held to account. The Prime Minister called for 9 inquiries in the last Parliament. Does he not see that by resisting this one, people will start to worry about a cover-up?
Starmer and Jess Phillips got brutally shot down for what might be the most disgusting cover-up of British politics.
Now, what has the government said to that? Well, of course, they turned down that demand for an inquiry. They voted it down on Wednesday. 364 MPs, including also members of the Lib Dems, voting against it.
Labour is trying everything that they can to make this scandal go away, but the Brits are furious over this betrayal of justice.
Even Jess Phillips has suggested some kind of inquiry might be justified. I think, I'd like to see them just get out there and arrest and prosecute all the coppers, all the social workers, all the teachers, all of those in authority who turned their backs and let these kids get raped rather than be accused of racism.
Jess Phillips is flip-flopping, but it's too late as the public is demanding either accountability or her resignation.
The new year has started with a focus on the decades-long rape gang scandal. Across the country, thousands of girls were tortured and sexually abused at the hands of men who treated them as things to be used and disposed of, destroying many lives forever. The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right, there has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal.
The worst scandal in British history isn't going anywhere, and Starmer's excuses are being shut down.
But one victim from Telford says she wants a national inquiry because it will hold people accountable in a way that previous inquiries have not. It is very possible to have actions, take on more, and still have a national inquiry. So why won't he listen to victims and launch a national inquiry which would have the power to summon witnesses and make them give evidence under oath?
Starmer and Jess Phillips are being blasted for failing the victims and betraying this nation.
Because I have raised this issue, I've raised it in speeches, I've raised it publicly. He knows that as a minister, I would not have been speaking on this specific issue. I was not a Home Office minister, but Mr. Speaker, I will remind him about other victims who came to me who I did help. The victims of the Tavistock scandal who came to me as a minister. I didn't send them away like his safeguarding minister.
The tone-deaf Starmer is left baffled as Kemi Badenoch slams him and his cronies, especially Jess Phillips.
The reason why a national inquiry is important is because this issue is systemic. It has been involving local and national officials, the police, prosecutors and politicians. He talks about some of the local inquiries, but these interlinked issues cannot be covered by local inquiries alone.
Labour's getting exposed for not just being incompetent, but potentially complicit in these heinous crimes.
And not a single person in a position of authority has been held to account. The Prime Minister called for 9 inquiries in the last Parliament. Does he not see that by resisting this one, people will start to worry about a cover-up?
Mr. Speaker, this is an important issue, and we have to focus on the victims and survivors, and it isn't helpful. This sort of lies and misinformation. And
Starmer started having a mental breakdown because he knows his cover-up attempts are backfiring horribly.
At new areas, former Labour MP Anne Pryor said that there were councillors and MPs all over the country who knew what was going on but were terrified of being labelled racist. A national inquiry would ask if there was a racial or cultural motivation to some of these crimes where white girls were seen, as Jack Straw said, as easy meat. The member for Rotherham was sacked from Labour's front bench for speaking out about rape gangs. Does the Prime Minister now recognise that sacking people for telling the truth creates a chilling effect that means victims aren't listened to?
Labour's pathetic ministers knew the truth all along, but were running away like cowards.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has effectively told us that he's not able to do 2 things at the same time. This issue of a delay is a weak excuse, and I would say to him that by refusing this inquiry, he is enabling those people who wish to smear all British Muslims based on the actions of a small minority. He is talking about distraction tactics. Let us have the truth.
Starmer's idiotic and short-sighted actions are causing more harm, but he's too tone-deaf to listen.
He doesn't want questions asked of Labour politicians who may be complicit. He won't listen to the victims. He won't listen to the victims who are calling for a national inquiry. He is making this all about a bill this afternoon. Later today, he will tell Labour MPs, including in Telford, Rochdale, Bristol, Derby, Aylesbury, Oldham, Bradford, Peterborough, Coventry, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Ramsgate, tell all of these people to vote against a national inquiry into the gangs which have systematically gang raped children in their constituencies.
The ugly truth is out and the Labour Party is in crisis mode. They are terrified about being held accountable, and Starmer is doing everything that he can to stop the public inquiry from happening. Is it not weird that somehow the entire Labour Party seems united for once? Well, turns out that even now, there are some Labour ministers who refuse to be a part of this shameless cover-up. The entire country is pushing back hard and a furious backlash is mounting up. Meanwhile, Starmer and Jess Phillips are shutting down as they have no more excuses left.
There's also a lot of politics going on. There is a big debate in Westminster about whether or not we need a national grooming gangs inquiry. Now, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, the head of the Tories, she's been demanding one since the 2nd of January, after GB News exclusively revealed that Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, had denied an independent government-led inquiry into the scandal in Oldham.
Ask yourself, what should a government do when there's a huge scandal of this scale? The obvious answer is to investigate it, but Starmer and his cronies are not very keen on doing that. People are fuming over this idiotic delay and things are starting to look like a cover-up. They're trying to hide the truth and the actual facts are far more shocking than you're being led to believe. Both the Tories and Reform UK are pushing back on Starmer, but he's holding on to dear life to avoid holding Labour accountable.
Of this sort of abuse. Now, what has the government said to that? Well, of course, they turned down that demand for an inquiry. They voted it down on Wednesday. 364 MPs, including also members of the Lib Dems, voting against it. Many Labour MPs and senior public figures have defended that move by sticking by the perspective we don't need a proper inquiry because we already had the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Now,
what a shameful act of betrayal this was. The whole nation was demanding an inquiry, and even the victims wanted the criminals to be held accountable. However, sadly, the Labour Party cares more about protecting their own rather than providing justice to the victims. Now, they're trying to cover up this letdown with the same old excuse that there have been inquiries done in the past. Unfortunately, those inquiries have so many glaring flaws that it doesn't really hold any value when you look more carefully into it.
And everyone who looked into that inquiry knows that ICSA, as it's referred to, refused to investigate Britain's most notorious sex grooming scandals and barred key witnesses from giving evidence. Now, the inquiry was given hundreds of millions of pounds, plenty of powers, spoke to thousands of people over 7 years, but it totally neglected to look into the areas that already had significant reports on the abuse gangs.
What that really means is that 100 million of your money was wasted on a scam inquiry that was led by cowards who didn't have what it took to investigate the real truth. Make no mistake, it gets much more disgusting than this, as it turns out that they not only barred key testimonies, but straight up refused to investigate certain areas to hide the truth. This might explain why Labour is so scared of another inquiry that might bring out the real truth for everyone to see.
So ICSA decided to look into a town in Wales that literally had no data, rather than any of the many northern towns affected by this evil scourge. ICSA also elected to hear no evidence from survivors or experts who had recognised the pattern that had scarred so many towns. Now, if that information isn't damning enough about this so-called inquiry into the grooming gangs, then every single MP who voted against a proper one last week should watch back to the public hearings for what ICSA said on its opening day.
In what idiotic and delusional world does it make sense to ignore the towns that were literal hotspots for this heinous gang activity and instead focus on irrelevant areas? No matter how you look at it, the entire methodology screams of a cover-up, and there's even more evidence to suggest that. This previous inquiry is not credible at all. Not only does it omit information on purpose, it has a very clear bias of woke nonsense.
Well, this deliberate decision not to look forward, but really to look away, was made in 2020. Many victims and campaigners arguing at the time said that there was a cowardly reluctance to confront the overrepresentation of Pakistanis in group-based abuse. CPS prosecutor Nazir Afzal said last week that we do not need an inquiry because there has already been an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.
The whole thing is rotten to its very core, and it's shocking just how malicious the people we elected into power can get. Make no mistake, they made the deliberate choice to look away and not investigate these gangs properly because they were scared of being labelled racist. Woke virtue signalling matters more to them than securing any real justice for the victims. And now, the Labour MPs who are using this inquiry as an excuse should be ashamed of how they've done a complete U-turn on their stances. The same people who criticised the inquiry in the past are now somehow okay with it.
Labour MP Sarah Champion, she also voted against an inquiry. She's the MP for Rotherham. She told The Observer on Sunday that I don't want an inquiry that will kick everything into the long grass. I want action. But what did she say in 2020 after the inquiry decided to exclude evidence of sex grooming networks in Northern England? Well, she said, you have to question what they are trying to achieve. It's more than a missed opportunity.
And the answer is that they were trying to achieve a cover-up. They were trying to push the whole problem under the rug and hope that nobody asks about it again. This blatant hypocrisy by many Labour ministers is concerning to say the least. But what's more important is how Starmer and Jess Phillips are trying to control the narrative despite being shut down miserably in the PMQ debate.
I think Labour possibly are quite keen for this story to go away. They're quite keen for the coverage of the grooming gangs issue to pass because it has caused such a headache for the Prime Minister. And really, in terms of Labour figures who've sparked this challenge, the first people to call for an inquiry were Blue Labour, that group within the party, typically seen as more conservative-leaning.
The Labour Party is oddly united on this matter, but there are still a lot of people who are against Starmer's sinister plans. Currently, Starmer and Jess Phillips are praying that this story somehow goes away as the damage it has done to the Labour Party is immense. They've lost all credibility and the people simply don't trust them anymore. What's more is that the very Muslim community that they claim to be protecting are being hurt by this. Even they are appalled by this disgusting denial of justice. As a result, many Labour MPs are rebelling against Starmer's narrative and it's hurting him more than you think.
ICSA's so-called investigation into the gangs was a sham, and in the words of legendary Rochdale campaigner Maggie Oliver, a cover-up. Now, as I say, she is legendary. She came forward to me last night with a damning accusation that has sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Now, she claims that independent inquiry was nothing short of a cover-up because of the information that they included when she came forward with her testimony.
Every passing day, we're seeing more evidence come out that confirms that there's a huge cover-up going on right now. This isn't just the biggest scandal in recent decades, it's the most disgusting betrayal of justice by Labour's cronies as well. This inquiry that Starmer keeps championing is turning out to be nothing more than a huge waste of our money and a cowardly scam. If they're all so afraid to call out the criminals, someone has to, and the British public is demanding answers.
The Health Secretary, Wes, said that he was worried, he was concerned about the rhetoric surrounding the grooming gang debate, insofar as he thought focusing on the ethnicity, the fact that they're all Pakistani Muslim men, was putting the Muslim community in danger, and he feared that it might lead to another New Zealand-style mosque massacre. Now, we don't want that, obviously, but we must talk about who did it.
What does it tell you about the priorities of this government when they're more concerned about hiding the truth over ensuring justice for the countless victims of this scandal? It's obvious that they're so out of touch with reality that they've lost all plot of how to run a country. Starmer is completely out of his depth and his cronies are just as incompetent as him. Of course, their concern for protecting the innocent Muslim communities in Britain is perfectly valid, but Labour's approach is actually harming those communities.
illustrating the same attitude by hand-wringing, guilt-trip, middle-class white people, usually politicians or coppers or social workers who are terrified of being labelled as racist or Islamophobic, and that's what enabled the rape gangs in the first place. Come on, Wes, it is time to get rid of that opinion, right?
The only reason why this scandal continued unchecked for more than a decade is because people in power were too afraid to speak the truth. They didn't want to be labelled racist or Islamophobic, and Labour is doing the exact thing now. What they fail to understand is that this attitude of avoiding and hiding the truth only serves to harm everyone. The victims are denied justice and the innocent Muslims are smeared because this government is too cowardly to do its job and punish the actual criminals.
I mean, certainly the perpetrators of those rapes over the last 20 or 30 years, with one or two small exceptions, they have not been in danger from criminal justice, the police, or anybody. I mean, if anything, as we well know, and has been documented and proven as a fact, they've been largely and roundly protected. So the fact that Wes Streeting is now coming out and saying that effectively we should all shut our mouths, a bit like we were told to do under fear of criminal charges and imprisonment in the summer riots.
Most of these criminal gang members were Muslim men from Pakistan. That is an undeniable fact, and it is something that needs to be talked about. On top of that, when Starmer and his idiots try to protect literal criminals, they validate the idea that the governments are giving special treatment to minorities. Naturally, that leads to unjust hatred and resentment among these communities and ends up completely backfiring. This government needs to get its head out of the ground and focus on law and order instead of telling us what to say and what not to say.
The government telling us that we should not comment on things that are inconvenient to the government, to their narrative, even if they are true, because obviously they have no answer, they have no excuse, they have no way out of explaining why this was allowed to happen continually for decades and why, of course, it was covered up, largely, I have to say, by Labour-led councils.
Make no mistake, in reality, Labour doesn't even care about the minorities. They're using these minorities to further their sinister agenda of socialism and multiculturalism. We saw it happen during the riots, the Southport attacks, and now we're seeing it happen all over again, but on a much bigger scale. Starmer is obsessed with trying to control our freedom of speech, and that is because he is too insecure to have his ideas challenged. Even in the PMQ, he completely shut down like a stuttering idiot who has no idea what he's on about.
You know the morning email that MPs get from their party head office which says, "This is the line today, everybody." Clearly that goes out most days now when it comes to talking about the atrocities of child rape over the last 30 or 40 years. And Wes Streeting, I'm afraid, and I did think better of him actually. I thought he was almost one of the good guys because he's a bit more right.
I don't know why he's getting all this good press. He's going to be the latest loser who screws up the...
The entire Labour Party is behaving like a mindless hive mind. They are saying what they're told by Starmer and his cronies like zombies and not bothering to question it even more a minute. Even the more rational and sane MPs are now bottling their reputation by being mindless drones of Starmer. They're being told to cover up this scandal, and those who refuse, Starmer does what he does best. He silences them.
Even Jess Phillips has suggested some kind of inquiry might be justified. I think, I'd like to see them just get out there and arrest and prosecute all the coppers, all the social workers, all the teachers, all of those in authority who turned their backs and let these kids get raped rather than be accused of racism.
There's a huge amount of pressure on this government, and while Starmer is having a mental breakdown, Jess Phillips is backtracking. She's now agreeing to a limited inquiry, but it's too little too late. The British public are fuming over this slow and out-of-touch government, and at this point, a limited inquiry isn't enough. The only way Labour can save what little credibility they have left is to either hold a large-scale inquiry or start arresting all those disgusting people who are suspected of being complicit in this mess. There need to be proper trials and justice must be served, ideally as soon as possible.
Labour's attitude, far right if you want a public inquiry, that kind of thing. The fact is, it's pretty clear to me that some of these Labour politicians, some senior Labour politicians, still think it's a bit racist, to bring this up, to go after those poor Pakistani Muslim men. It's a bit racist, it's Islamophobic.
The truth of the matter is as simple as the fact that Labour is still insistent upon its insane agenda. They will continue to whine about racism while these gangs will escape justice. If that happens, it'll be a matter of national shame. Starmer is smearing everyone who asks for a public inquiry as some sort of far-right racist, and that shows just how stupid his thinking is. This is Labour's true face, and their own reports are exposing them.
It's concluded that talking about sex groomers was an example of Islamophobia. This was adopted as official policy by the Labour Party. It explains their attitude now. It explains why these groomers got away with it so long. Hand-wringing, white, middle-class politicians terrified to be accused of racism.
The Muslims must find it offensive that Labour thinks so lowly of them. Sadly, this is Labour's official policy, and they're brainlessly following it despite the huge backlash. They're afraid of being racist and don't really care about the victims, so that leaves only one question. Can we trust a government like this to ensure justice? The way things are looking, they'll continue to make a mockery out of Britain till Starmer is forced to resign.
Everybody who has suggested that it is somehow racist to highlight the ethnicity of all these men is part of the problem. They are culpable too, because they've contributed to the culture that allowed this to be covered up and continues to allow this to be covered up. And there are commentators in the media, there are commentators on X who are still shrieking about racism and far-rightery.
It's not just the Labour Party either. The entire woke liberal mindset is part of the problem. They've created this culture where something as simple and factual as pointing out the ethnicity of disgusting criminals is now not okay. If calling out a Pakistani criminal who committed one of the worst possible crimes against innocent girls is considered racist by Labour, then it shows just how deluded and out of touch with reality they are.
It's got absolutely the square root of nothing to do with Islamophobia. I don't feel an ounce of anti-Islam in my reading of this whole thing. What I see is criminals, barefaced criminals, monsters and apologies of a human being. And I see that needs to be called out.
Quite literally, everyone who is outraged by the way Starmer is treating this matter has no problem with Islam and Muslims. Britain has always been a tolerant country, but it's Starmer and his Labour gang that are making things difficult by protecting criminals under the false pretense of not being racist. They're hurting the victims, they're hurting our justice system, and they're hurting the very minorities they claim to be protecting. However, given how Starmer and Jess Phillips started making concessions after being brutally shut down in the PMQ, there might be hope that they'll listen. You can have your voice be heard by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.